going to move on to a couple. We have several questions about reciprocity in the wake of the Bruen decision. Start with William S. And he asks, does the Bruen ruling and New York City's recently passed concealed carry laws give the United States Supreme Court the motivation/reason to take a case addressing national reciprocity? And he asks, if they about sensitive places in New York City and overturning that. If that gets overturned, does that open the door for sensitive places? And several other questions. Ken and Luigi both ask for their specific states where they're at, if we could see any movement in reciprocity. So what do you think is going to be the landscape for reciprocity now that Bruen has been decided?
Yeah, that's a really good question, right? I think it's one of those things that was left unaddressed in Bruen, just completely unaddressed. Unlike Wren v. DC, which is the case where DC's may issue law was thrown out, the Supreme Court did not require that New York issue permits to people from out of state even. They didn't require that New York recognize any other state's permits. Really, they just focused completely on the process for obtaining a permit and how New York's subjective, may issue law was not constitutional. But they didn't talk at all about reciprocity. And I think that's something that's going to take a while to get addressed.
Yeah.
That's been a top priority of the gun rights movement at the federal level for a long time. Rep. Hudson out of North Carolina, he's been pushing for national reciprocity for years, but it's never gone anywhere.
Right.
The problem being that you need 60 votes in the Senate, and while you could, during the beginning of the Trump administration, you might have been able to get, mid 50s on a bill like that. It's probably very hard to pass something like that at the federal level. I mean, that's why you've seen basically no gun rights legislation for decades in the United States. I mean, the biggest federal accomplishment for gun rights since the turn of the millennium has been the expiration of the Sullivan's ban, which required the federal government to do nothing.
Right.
You just haven't had much in the way of gun rights legislation at the national level, and it's unlikely that you're going to see national reciprocity make it through. And so, it's another area where the courts are probably your best bet, and there hasn't really been much in the way of an organized challenge to they're in favor of national reciprocity or challenging the different states, require lack of recognition for other states' permits.
Yeah.
Maybe you have a full faith and credit challenge. I don't know. I haven't seen anyone seriously talking about this in the legal, the gun rights legal landscape. So it doesn't seem like something that's coming up anytime soon. I think there's other fights that the gun rights movement, the gun rights groups feel more confident in taking on. And this one is probably down the list of ways. So I wouldn't expect national reciprocity to happen anytime soon, either by legislation or court order.
Yeah.
The best thing you can hope for on that front is something like what happened in Virginia a couple of years ago, which is where they recognized every other state's permit. And so sometimes that'll give you, if your state does that, that often gives you a few more states where your permit's recognized, because some states require, mutual recognition to recognize other people's permits. But, if you're talking about places like DC, New York, California, it's unlikely that they're ever going to voluntarily recognize anyone else's permits. And it'll probably be a long time before anyone tries a case like that in a serious way to force them to recognize it. So
yeah,
I don't think that Bruen really has much of an effect in this regard, at least not for a while. There's just so many other cases that they're gonna go through first.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And you could even kind of tell in the Kavanaugh concurrent opinion in Bruen, where he seemed to be willing to leave a lot of room for states to handle their permitting. As so long as it was objective, he seemed to be like, hey, do what you want as long as you're objectively granting these permits. And it would just seems like a stretch to then immediately turn around and say, okay, now states, you must recognize every other state's permit. So I think you have a good point there that this is going to be something that's going to take either legislation at the federal level where there's a big 60 seat win for the Republican Party, or it's going to be a court case down the road. I think that's a good point.
Yeah, and I think there's more of a chance that you'll see courts force states to issue non-resident permits rather than to accept other states' permits, because at least in that case, the state would still have control over the process. And so, I just think it's a long ways off